Sarah Martinez dragged her exhausted body across the muddy obstacle course for what felt like the 100th time that week. Her lungs burned with each breath, and her muscles screamed in protest as she crawled under the barbed wire. The drill instructor's voice echoed across the training ground, harsh and unforgiving, cutting through the humid Georgia air like a knife. "Move it, Martinez. My grandmother could crawl faster than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. Sergeant Thompson barked, his face inches from hers as she emerged from under the wire, covered in mud and shame. Sarah had dreamed of becoming a Navy pilot since she was 12 years old. She had watched the Blue Angels perform at an air show near her hometown in Texas, and something inside her soul had ignited that day. The precision, the power, the grace of those jets dancing across the sky had spoken to her in a way nothing else ever had. She had spent her teenage years preparing for this moment, studying hard, staying in shape, and convincing her worried parents that the military was her calling. But now, 3 weeks into basic training, that dream felt as distant as the stars she once imagined herself flying toward. Every morning began at 4:30 with the sound of trash cans being kicked down the barracks hallway. Every day brought new challenges that seemed designed to break her spirit rather than build her strength. She watched as other recruits around her began to crack under the pressure, some quietly packing their bags in the middle of the night, others openly sobbing during the endless push-up sessions. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion, or even the constant yelling from the drill instructors. It was the growing realization that she might not be cut out for this life. Sarah had always been strong, always been determined. But this was different. This was a level of mental and physical demands that she had never imagined possible. During her lunch break that Tuesday, Sarah sat alone at a corner table in the mess hall, staring at her untouched tray of food. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the plastic spoon, not from weakness but from the emotional toll of constant failure. That morning, she had failed the rope climb exercise for the 3rd time in a row. The thick rope had slipped through her sweaty palms as she watched other recruits scale it with apparent ease. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Sarah Martinez had never been a quitter. In high school, she had been the captain of the soccer team, student council president, and valedictorian of her graduating class. She had never encountered a challenge she couldn't overcome through hard work and determination. But basic training was revealing weaknesses she never knew existed. Her upper body strength, which had seemed adequate during her pre-enlistment fitness tests, proved insufficient for the demanding exercises. Her confidence, once her greatest asset, had been systematically stripped away by weeks of constant criticism and failure. That evening, as she lay on her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. She would request a meeting with her commanding officer in the morning and discuss the possibility of discharge. The thought of going home, of facing her family and friends who had believed in her dream, filled her with shame. But the alternative seemed worse, continuing to struggle and fail publicly until she was eventually forced out anyway. She had seen it happen to other recruits. There was Marcus, who had lasted only 2 weeks before breaking down completely during a particularly brutal training exercise. There was Jennifer, who had seemed so confident and capable during their first week, but had gradually lost her spirit until she simply stopped trying. Sarah didn't want to become another casualty of the system, another young person who had reached too high and fallen too hard. The next morning came too quickly. As Sarah stood in formation with her fellow recruits, she felt like she was moving through a dream. The familiar routine of morning exercises felt different somehow, as if she was already separating herself from this life she was about to abandon. She went through the motions of the morning workout, her mind focused on the conversation she would have with her commanding officer after breakfast. But fate had other plans for Sarah Martinez. As the recruits were dismissed from their morning formation, a figure approached from across the training ground. He was tall and lean, with the kind of presence that made people stop and pay attention even from a distance. Sarah noticed that even Sergeant Thompson, who seemed to fear nothing and no one, straightened his posture and adjusted his uniform as the man approached. The stranger wore a different uniform than the regular training staff, with patches and insignia that Sarah didn't recognize. His face was weathered but kind, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with careful attention. As he drew closer, Sarah could see the special warfare pin on his chest. The mark of a Navy SEAL. "Which one is Martinez?" the SEAL asked, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone within earshot immediately focus their attention on him. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Had word of her intended discharge request somehow reached the higher-ups already? Was she about to be publicly humiliated in front of her entire unit? "That would be me, sir," she managed to say, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to hide among her fellow recruits. The SEAL studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. I need to speak with you privately." He turned to Sergeant Thompson. "I'll need to borrow Recruit Martinez for the morning." As they walked away from the formation, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. None of them seemed good. She had no idea that this unexpected encounter would change the entire trajectory of her military career, and quite possibly, her life. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez led Sarah to a small office building she had never seen before, located away from the main training areas. The building was unmarked and seemed to exist in a different world from the chaos of basic training. As they walked, Sarah tried to read his expression, but his face revealed nothing about his intentions. "Sit down, Martinez," he said, gesturing to a chair across from a simple desk. The office was sparse but functional, with only a few photographs on the walls showing various military operations. Sarah noticed that in several of the photos, she could make out the silhouette of Chief Rodriguez, though he looked younger, and the locations appeared to be in desert environments. "I've been watching you," Rodriguez began, leaning back in his chair. His tone was matter-of-fact, neither accusatory nor encouraging. "Your drill instructors have been filing reports about your performance, and I've been reviewing them with interest." Sarah's heart sank. This was it, the official notification that she was being kicked out of the program. She had wanted to quit on her own terms, but apparently, that choice was being taken away from her. "I know what you're thinking," Rodriguez continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You think you're here because you're failing. You think I'm about to tell you that you don't have what it takes to make it in the Navy." Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. The shame of her failures over the past 3 weeks seemed to fill the small room. "You're wrong," Rodriguez said simply. "I'm here because you have something most of these other recruits don't have, something that can't be taught in basic training." This was not at all what Sarah had expected to hear. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since they had sat down. "Every report I've read mentions the same thing about you, Martinez. You fail, you get back up, and you try again. You fail harder, you get back up faster. You never quit, even when quitting would be the smart thing to do." Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "Do you know how rare that quality is?" Sarah shook her head, still not understanding where this conversation was heading. "Most people have a breaking point," Rodriguez explained. "They reach a level of difficulty or pain or exhaustion where they just stop fighting. It's human nature. But some people, a very few people, don't have that switch in their brains. They'll keep going until their bodies literally can't function anymore." He stood up and walked to one of the photographs on the wall. It showed a group of soldiers in what appeared to be a mountainous region, all of them looking exhausted but determined. This was taken during a mission in Afghanistan 3 years ago. We had been moving for 18 hours straight through some of the most difficult terrain you can imagine. We had lost radio contact with our base, we were running low on water, and we had enemy forces tracking us. Rodriguez pointed to a figure in the photograph that Sarah now realized was him, though he looked much younger and wore a full beard. Everyone in this photo wanted to quit at some point during that mission. Everyone except one person, and that person saved all of our lives because he refused to give up when giving up would have been the logical thing to do. Rodriguez returned to his seat and fixed Sarah with a steady gaze. "That's the quality I see in you, Martinez. Not in your physical performance. That can be improved with training. Not in your technical skills. Those can be taught. But in your fundamental refusal to quit, even when you're failing at everything else." Sarah felt a mixture of confusion and hope stirring in her chest. "I don't understand, sir." I was planning to request discharge this morning. I can't even climb a rope. How can you say I don't quit when that's exactly what I was about to do? Because you haven't quit yet, Rodriguez replied. You've been thinking about it for days, maybe weeks, but you're still here. You're still trying. That tells me everything. I need to know about who you really are. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder with her name on it. I've been authorized to make you an offer, Martinez. It's not something we do often, and it's not something we take lightly. Sarah's pulse quickened. This conversation had taken so many unexpected turns that she had no idea what might come next. There's a special program within the Navy, Rodriguez continued. It's designed for personnel who show exceptional potential in specific areas, even if they're struggling with conventional training methods. The program is small, selective, and highly classified. He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room, regardless of whether you accept or decline the offer. Do you understand? Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry with anticipation. The Navy has been developing new approaches to underwater reconnaissance and rescue operations. These missions require personnel who can operate independently in extremely challenging conditions, often with minimal support and high probability of failure. Rodriguez paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We need people who simply will not quit, no matter what happens. The implications of what he was saying began to dawn on Sarah. This wasn't just about getting through basic training anymore. This was about something much bigger, much more important than her personal struggles with rope climbing and obstacle courses. The training for this program is harder than anything you've experienced so far, Rodriguez warned. It's designed to push people beyond their breaking points to see who has that special quality I mentioned. Most candidates don't make it through the first week. He leaned back in his chair and studied her face carefully. But if you do make it through, if you prove that you have what we think you have, you'll be trained for missions that could save lives, real lives, in real situations where failure isn't just disappointing. It's deadly. Sarah felt something stirring inside her that she hadn't felt since her first day of basic training. Hope. Not just hope for herself, but hope that she might be part of something meaningful, something that could make a real difference. What would I have to do, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they had met. First, you'd have to survive the next 3 weeks of basic training. Then, if you're selected, you'd begin 6 months of the most intense training the Navy has to offer. He closed the folder and looked directly into her eyes. The question is, Martinez, are you ready to find out what you're really made of? Sarah stared at Chief Rodriguez for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing through the implications of his offer. Just an hour ago, she had been preparing to quit, to walk away from her childhood dream and return home defeated. Now she was being offered a chance at something she had never even imagined possible. I need some time to think about this, Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew her answer. The spark that had been dimming for weeks was suddenly burning bright again. I figured you might, Rodriguez replied, standing up from his desk. But I can't give you long. The program selection process begins next week, and if you're going to be considered, you need to finish basic training strong. Not just surviving, excelling. He walked her to the door of the office building. Martinez, I want you to understand something. This offer isn't charity. We don't recruit people we feel sorry for. We recruit people who have something special, something we need. If I didn't believe you had that quality, we wouldn't be having this conversation. As Sarah walked back toward the main training area, her mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. The obstacles that had seemed impossible just that morning now felt different somehow. They weren't barriers designed to defeat her. They were challenges designed to reveal who she really was. When she rejoined her unit for the afternoon training session, Sergeant Thompson looked at her with curiosity. Everything all right, Martinez? You look different. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even her. Everything is perfect. The afternoon brought the rope climbing exercise that had been her nemesis for 3 weeks running. As Sarah approached, The thick rope. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the voice in her head that whispered about previous failures. But this time she also heard Chief Rodriguez's words about people who refuse to quit. She gripped the rope with both hands, feeling the rough fibers against her palms. Instead of thinking about reaching the top, she focused on the next grip, the next movement upward. When her arms began to burn with fatigue, she thought about the soldiers in that photograph, moving through 18 hours of hell because someone refused to give up. Halfway up the rope, Sarah's arms were screaming. Her technique was still imperfect, her form still flawed, but something fundamental had changed. She wasn't climbing to avoid embarrassment or to meet someone else's expectations. She was climbing because quitting was no longer an option she would consider. When her hand touched the bell at the top of the rope, Sarah heard a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. Silence. The other recruits had stopped their own exercises to watch her descent. Even Sergeant Thompson stood quietly, a look of surprise on his usually stern face. "Better," he said simply as Sarah's feet touched the ground. Coming from Sergeant Thompson, it was practically a standing ovation. That evening, Sarah lay on her bunk and wrote a letter to her parents. She had been avoiding their calls for the past week, too ashamed of her struggles to face their questions about how training was going. Now she found herself describing not just her challenges but her determination to overcome them. "I know I haven't been calling much," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. It's harder than anything I've ever done, but I'm learning things about myself that I never knew before. I'm learning that I'm stronger than I thought, not just physically, but in ways that matter more." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of intense training and gradual improvement. Sarah still struggled with some exercises, still faced moments of doubt and exhaustion, but she approached each challenge with a different mindset. She began to see failure not as a judgment of her worth, but as information about what she needed to work on. More importantly, she began to notice things about her fellow recruits that she had missed before. There was Michael, who was naturally gifted at physical challenges but gave up quickly when things didn't come easily. There was Ashley, who was technically proficient but crumbled under pressure. There was David, who was strong and capable but looked for excuses to avoid the most difficult exercises. Sarah realized that Chief Rodriguez had been right. The quality he had identified in her was indeed rare. Most people had a point where they stopped fighting, where they decided the cost was too high or the goal was too difficult. But Sarah found that her stopping point kept moving further and further away. During the final week of basic training, the recruits faced their most challenging test, a 12-hour exercise that combined physical endurance, problem-solving, and teamwork under extreme stress. It began before dawn with a 5-mile run in full gear, followed by a series of increasingly difficult obstacles that required both individual performance and group coordination. By hour 8, half the recruits were struggling to continue. By hour 10, several had been removed from the exercise due to exhaustion or injury. Sarah's body was running on fumes, her legs felt like concrete, and her pack seemed to weigh twice as much as when they had started. But her mind remained focused on the next task, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that she belonged here. When the exercise finally ended, Sarah found herself among the 12 recruits who had completed every task without assistance or accommodation. As they stood in formation, exhausted but proud, Sergeant Thompson walked slowly down the line, making eye contact with each successful candidate. When he reached Sarah, he stopped and studied her face for a long moment. "Martinez," he said, loud enough for the entire group to hear. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't sure you'd make it through your first month. Today, you've shown me what real determination looks like." He paused, and Sarah could see something like respect in his eyes. That's the kind of sailor the Navy needs. That's the kind of person who makes a difference when it matters most. As the ceremony concluded, and the recruits were dismissed to prepare for graduation the next day, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Chief Rodriguez, who had appeared as quietly as he had that first day they met. "Congratulations, Martinez," he said. "You did exactly what I thought you would do." You found a way to succeed, even when success seemed impossible. He handed her an envelope. Inside are your orders for the next phase of your training. Report to the address on Monday at 600 hours. Bring only what you can carry in one bag, and prepare for 6 months that will change your life. As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah opened the envelope and read the brief message inside. She was being transferred to a facility she had never heard of for training in skills that weren't even named. But at the bottom of the page was a single line that made her smile. Recommendation: this recruit has demonstrated the psychological resilience and determination required for special operations training. Approved for immediate advancement to Phase 1. That night, as Sarah packed her few belongings for the journey ahead, she thought about the girl who had been ready to quit just 3 weeks earlier. That person felt like a stranger now, someone who had given up before discovering what she was truly capable of achieving. The bus ride to the special training facility took Sarah through landscapes she had never seen before. They traveled for hours through dense forests and rolling hills, eventually arriving at a gate that looked more like the entrance to a national park than a military installation. No signs indicated what lay beyond the checkpoint, and the guards who verified her orders did so with a professional silence that made Sarah wonder what she was getting herself into. The facility itself was unlike any military base she had imagined. Instead of the concrete buildings and parade grounds of basic training, she found herself in a complex of modern structures built into the natural landscape. Everything was designed to blend with the surrounding forest, giving the impression of a place that existed in secret, hidden from the outside world. Sarah was assigned to a dormitory room that she would share with 3 other women, all of whom had arrived the same day. Her roommates were Lisa, a former college swimmer from California, Maria, an Army veteran who had served in Iraq, and Jennifer, a Coast Guard rescue specialist from Alaska. Despite their different backgrounds, Sarah could see immediately that they all shared something in common, an intensity and focus that set them apart from the typical military personnel she had encountered. "Welcome to the unknown," said Lisa as Sarah unpacked her single bag. "Nobody here seems to know exactly what we're training for, just that it's supposed to be the hardest thing we've ever done." The next morning began at 4 a.m. with a briefing, unlike anything Sarah had experienced in basic training. Instead of the shouting and intimidation tactics she had grown accustomed to, the instructors spoke in calm, measured tones about expectations and objectives. The lead instructor, a woman named Commander Walsh, looked to be in her 40s with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested extensive combat experience. "You're here because you've demonstrated specific qualities that our program requires," Commander Walsh explained to the group of 24 candidates. "Physical fitness is important, but it's not the primary focus of this training. We're more interested in how you think, how you adapt, and how you perform when everything goes wrong." The first week of training was unlike anything Sarah could have anticipated. Instead of focusing on strength and endurance, the exercises were designed to test psychological resilience and decision-making under pressure. Candidates were placed in scenarios where there were no clear right answers, where success required creative thinking and the ability to function effectively despite incomplete information. One exercise involved being dropped individually in a forest with minimal supplies and told to reach a checkpoint 20 miles away within 36 hours. The catch was that the checkpoint location was provided as a riddle rather than coordinates, and the terrain was filled with obstacles designed to test problem-solving skills as much as physical endurance. Sarah found herself alone in the wilderness, at dawn, carrying only a small pack with basic survival gear and a cryptic message about where the river bends toward the morning sun and the stones remember ancient paths. She had grown up in suburban Texas and had never been much of an outdoors person, but she approached the challenge the same way she had learned to approach everything else, one step at a time, refusing to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task. By the end of her first day, Sarah was exhausted, her feet were covered in blisters, and she had made several wrong turns that cost her precious time. But she had also solved the riddle and was making steady progress toward what she believed was the correct location. More importantly, she had discovered something about herself. She actually enjoyed the mental challenge of navigating through uncertainty. When she finally reached the checkpoint, Sarah was surprised to find that she was the 7th candidate to arrive out of the original 24. Several others appeared throughout the day, but by evening, 5 candidates had missed the deadline and were removed from the program. Not everyone is cut out for this type of work, Commander Walsh explained during the debrief session. The ability to operate independently, to make decisions without perfect information, and to persevere through setbacks, these are qualities that can't be taught. Either you have them or you don't. The second week brought underwater training that pushed Sarah's limits in ways she hadn't expected. The sessions took place in a specially designed facility that could simulate various underwater environments, from clear tropical waters to murky, zero-visibility conditions. Candidates learned basic diving techniques, underwater navigation, and most challenging of all, how to remain calm and focused when things went wrong beneath the surface. During one exercise, Sarah found herself in complete darkness, 40 feet, underwater, with her breathing apparatus suddenly malfunctioning. The scenario was designed to test panic response, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of fear that accompanied potentially life-threatening situations. But instead of panicking, she remembered Chief Rodriguez's words about people who refuse to quit, and she methodically worked through the problem-solving steps she had been taught. When she finally surfaced, having successfully completed the emergency ascent procedure, Sarah was met by Instructor Rodriguez himself. He had apparently been observing the underwater training without her knowledge. "How did that feel, Martinez?" he asked as she climbed out of the pool. "Terrifying," Sarah answered honestly, "but manageable, like a problem that needed to be solved rather than a disaster that was happening to me." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. Fear is useful information. It tells you when something is dangerous, but it shouldn't control your decision-making process." By the end of the second week, the group had been reduced to 18 candidates. The departures weren't always due to failure in the traditional sense. Some candidates chose to leave when they realized the psychological demands of the training weren't compatible with their personal goals or temperament. The third week introduced Sarah to weapons training and combat scenarios that were far more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in basic training. Instead of simply learning to shoot accurately, candidates were taught to make split-second decisions about when to engage, when to retreat, and when to use non-lethal alternatives. The ETSM scenarios were incredibly realistic, using advanced simulation technology to create situations where the stress and confusion felt genuine. Sarah found herself in simulated hostage situations, ambush scenarios, and rescue operations where success required not just physical skills, but the ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. During one particularly challenging exercise, Sarah was part of a 4-person team tasked with rescuing simulated hostages from a mock building while avoiding civilian casualties. The scenario was designed so that the obvious approaches would fail, requiring the team to improvise and adapt their strategy multiple times during the mission. When Sarah's team finally completed the exercise, they discovered they were the only group to successfully rescue all the hostages without any simulated casualties. The key to their success hadn't been superior firepower or perfect execution of standard procedures. It had been their willingness to abandon their initial plan when it wasn't working, and their ability to communicate effectively under stress. "This is what real special operations work looks like," explained the instructor during the debrief. "You can train for specific scenarios, but every real mission will be different from anything you've practiced. Success depends on your ability to adapt, improvise, and work as a team when the unexpected happens." As the first month of training neared its end, Sarah realized that she had found something she never knew she was looking for. The work was challenging in ways that used every aspect of her abilities: physical, mental, and emotional. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that the skills she was learning could be used to save lives in situations where conventional approaches wouldn't work. On the final Friday of the month, Commander Walsh called the remaining candidates together for what she described as a reality check briefing. "You've completed the introductory phase of your training," she announced. "From this point forward, everything becomes more difficult, more realistic, and more dangerous. Some of you will decide that this isn't the path you want to pursue, and that's okay. But for those who choose to continue, I want you to understand what you're committing to. She paused and looked each candidate in the eye. You're training to become part of a team that operates in situations where failure isn't just disappointing. It's deadly. The missions you'll undertake will require you to put yourself in harm's way to protect others. You'll work in hostile environments, often with minimal support, and you'll be responsible for making decisions that can mean the difference between life and death for people you've never met. As Sarah listened to Commander Walsh's words, she felt the same stirring of purpose that she had experienced in Chief Rodriguez's office weeks earlier. This wasn't just about proving she could succeed at something difficult. This was about becoming part of something meaningful, something that could make a real difference in the world. The second phase of training began with a stark reality that Sarah hadn't fully grasped during her first month at the facility. Of the original 24 candidates who had started the program, only 14 remained. The departures hadn't been dramatic. No one had quit in tears or been carried away on stretchers. Instead, people had simply reached their personal limits and made the mature decision that this path wasn't for them. Sarah's roommate Jennifer had been among those who left. She had excelled at the physical challenges but struggled with the psychological pressure of the combat scenarios. I realized I joined the Coast Guard to save people, Jennifer explained as she packed her belongings. This training is about something different, something I'm not sure I'm cut out for. Sarah understood Jennifer's decision, but she also knew with absolute certainty that she belonged here. Every challenge had revealed new capabilities she didn't know she possessed, and every success had strengthened her conviction that this was her true calling. The advanced training phase introduced Sarah to skills that felt like they belonged in a spy movie rather than military instruction. She learned advanced surveillance techniques, how to gather intelligence in hostile environments, and how to blend into civilian populations while maintaining her mission focus. The instructors were all experienced operatives who had served in classified missions around the world, and their stories gave Sarah glimpses into the kind of work she was preparing for. One instructor, Master Chief Patterson, had spent 15 years conducting rescue operations in some of the world's most dangerous locations. During a break in training, he pulled Sarah aside to discuss her progress. "Martinez, you have something special," he said, echoing the words Chief Rodriguez had spoken months earlier. Most people think special operations work is about being physically superior or exceptionally brave, but the real skill is being able to function normally when everything around you is abnormal. He gestured toward the other candidates who were practicing tactical communication techniques nearby. Look at your classmates. They're all capable people, all highly trained. But watch how they respond when we change the parameters of an exercise unexpectedly. Some adapt immediately, some take time to adjust, and some never quite recover their rhythm. Sarah had noticed the same thing. During exercises where the instructors would suddenly change the rules or introduce unexpected complications, she found that her response was almost automatic. Assess the new situation, adjust her approach, and continue working toward the objective without getting rattled by the change. That ability to stay focused and adaptable under pressure is exactly what we need for the kind of missions our unit handles, Patterson continued. We work in situations where the intelligence is incomplete, where the conditions change rapidly, and where there's no backup plan if things go wrong. The fourth month of training brought Sarah's most challenging experience yet, a week-long exercise that simulated a real-world rescue mission in a hostile environment. The scenario involved infiltrating a mock foreign facility to extract 3 simulated hostages while avoiding detection by a large security force. The exercise would take place over several days and nights, with candidates required to live rough in the field while maintaining operational readiness. Sarah was assigned to a 3-person team with 2 other candidates: Marcus, a former Marine who had served in Afghanistan, and Angela, a Navy intelligence specialist with experience in electronic surveillance. Their mission briefing was intentionally vague, requiring them to develop their own operational plan based on limited information about the target facility and the security measures they would face. The first 2 days of the exercise went smoothly. Sarah's team successfully conducted surveillance of the target, identified security patterns, and developed a plan for infiltrating the facility. Sarah found herself naturally taking on a leadership role. coordinating between Marcus's tactical expertise and Angela's technical skills. But on the third night, everything went wrong in ways that no amount of planning could have anticipated. What was supposed to be a straightforward infiltration became a running battle when their entry point was discovered by roving security patrols. Instead of a careful extraction of simulated hostages, the team found themselves in a desperate fight to complete their mission, while under constant pressure from a much larger opposing force. For 6 hours, Sarah's team moved through the darkened facility, adapting their plan moment by moment as new obstacles appeared. When their primary escape route was blocked, Sarah made the split-second decision to use an alternative exit that required rappelling down a 3-story building in darkness. When their communications equipment was damaged during the extraction, she coordinated the team using hand signals and predetermined contingency protocols. Most challenging of all, when Marcus was wounded during a simulated firefight in the final phase of the mission, Sarah had to make the decision to continue with the extraction while Angela provided medical support. The scenario required her to complete the most difficult part of the mission essentially alone, while under time pressure and with simulated enemy forces closing in on their position. When the exercise finally ended at dawn on the 4th day, Sarah's team had successfully extracted all 3 hostages and reached their designated extraction point. They were exhausted, covered in mud and simulated blood, but they had accomplished their mission despite facing complications that had caused 2 other teams to fail. During the debrief session, Commander Walsh reviewed each team's performance in detail. When she reached Sarah's team, her assessment was more detailed than usual. Team 3 faced the most significant complications during this exercise, Walsh explained to the entire group. Their original plan became completely unusable within the first hour of the actual operation. Success required them to improvise continuously while maintaining focus on their primary objective. She pulled up video footage from the exercise showing Sarah's team moving through the facility during the height of the crisis. "Watch Martinez here," Walsh said, pointing to Sarah on the screen. "Notice how she processes new information, makes decisions quickly, and communicates with her team even under extreme stress. This is what leadership looks like in special operations." After the debrief, Chief Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's side as she was cleaning her equipment. It had been weeks since she had spoken with him directly, and his presence reminded her of how far she had come since that first conversation in his office. "How do you feel, Martinez?" he asked, using the same question he had posed after her first underwater emergency exercise. "Like I've found what I was meant to do," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Not just the missions or the training, but the responsibility of being part of something that matters." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's the right answer. Because what comes next is going to test everything you've learned here."